They broke the doorposts and shook the whole house. They tumbled into the street, straining and groaning, and fought in front of the crowd. Their struggle was so fierce they even knocked down a part of the city's enormous wall. Just getting a little water. The sacred marriage. Gilgamesh wrestled against the strong man from the wilds for a long time, but the Lord of Uruk was finally able to throw Enkidu over his knee, and in that moment something unexpected happened. Gilgamesh's fury suddenly fled from him. He released his opponent as it dawned on the king that Enkidu was the star of Anu, foretold in his dreams. Deeply moved by this revelation, Gilgamesh called for silence. Quote, Enkidu has no match, unquote, he announced. Quote, he was born in the wilderness and no man can stand against him, unquote. When Enkidu heard these words, his eyes in turn were filled with tears of joy, and he sat down crying. Enkidu came over, took his hand, then hugged him tightly. Enkidu returned the embrace. Quote, you are a man without match, unquote, he said to Gilgamesh between his tears. Your head is raised above all others. Then they kissed each other passionately, and their hearts were joined together as one. From that moment on, they were inseparable, sharing even the same bed. As they sat there in the street holding each other, Enkidu soon began to cry again. When Gilgamesh asked what troubled him, Enkidu said that there was a mighty terrible demon, Humbaba, who guarded the legendary cedar forest far away in the high mountains. Quote, his shout is like a raging torrent, and he breathes the fire of death. Enkidu fearfully added, I'm not very good at what that was a monster that was killed. But Gilgamesh felt suddenly inspired by his friend's words, crying out at his own audacity, let's kill him, you and me, and drive evil out of the land. Grabbing Enkidu's hand, Gilgamesh sprung up and rushed down the street to the great brick mountain, the ziggurat on whose table-like roof sat the temple where his mother lived. They climbed the grand stairway up the pyramid's face, then crossed into the chambered hall within the house of heaven. Hand in hand, Gilgamesh and Enkidu approached the throne of Ishtar, where Ninsun sat, awaiting them. After listening to Gilgamesh relate all that had happened with Enkidu, she retired to her inner chamber and put on rare jewels and a beautiful golden robe. She climbed a tall parapet to an altar on the roof where she prayed to the sun god Shamash. As Ninsun kneeled in meditation, the Lord of the Sun spoke down to her, quote, indeed, Gilgamesh must kill Humbaba, the god decreed. Furthermore, all the evil things that infested the land must be killed. After giving thanks, Ninsun descended from the parapet, calling out to her attendants and to Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Then, in the great hall of Ishtar, she enacted a sacred ceremony. While Gilgamesh offered incense in honor of Shamash, Ninsun spoke to Enkidu in a ritual manner. Quote, awesome man, you are not my child, unquote, she addressed him. Quote, but now I take you as my own, unquote. And she placed strands of precious gems around his neck. Then he was taken away by the sacred love priestesses, and they made him into one of them, initiated in the mysteries of the temple. Enkidu's sexual powers were spiritually increased and strengthened for the sake of Gilgamesh. Then Gilgamesh and Enkidu were joined together in a sacred marriage by the high priestess, and this public bond was celebrated by the entire city with holiday and feasting. After that, the two men lived in the king's great palace, and they did everything together. They played athletic games and hunted lions in the nearby hills. They even sat side by side in the king's audience chamber, and Gilgamesh had all who approached him there honor his companion as well. One day, Gilgamesh ordered great armor, battle axes, and swords forged for the two comrades. When these weapons were ready, they prepared to leave to seek out the cedar forest. As they prayed to Shamash on the morning of their departure, the city elders gathered. Quote, Enkidu will shield his friend from harm, unquote, they said to the king's mate. Quote, he will guide him past all dangers, unquote. To Gilgamesh they advised, quote, let Enkidu go ahead of you. He knows the way, he's traveled the road. The one who goes in front guards his companion. Shamash grant you your wish. Then the warriors left, determined to find Humbaba in the distant mountains. Soon the city's gates were far behind. Gilgamesh was joyful and content, for he had been transformed by Enkidu's love. At last, the king was on his way to finding his true purpose in life. The fight with the demon Humbaba. The two men inspired each other onward, and in 3 days they had crossed the distance that usually took a month and a half to walk. Soon they came to the mountains. After climbing for some time and seeing no one, they finally reached the top of the tall crest. But beyond that they could go no further, for their path ahead was blocked by a huge bolted gate. Enkidu walked up and threw back the bolt, but as he began to push the massive door open, he was overcome by terrible fear. He stopped. He stepped back. Then Gilgamesh talked to his beloved. Quote, touch my heart and you will not fear death. Shouting together, we'll rise up like a kettle drum. Stand, friend, we'll go side by side. Forget death, fear nothing. With unwaning strength, the wary man going in front guards his body and protects his companion. Even though they fall, they have made a name for themselves. Unquote. Heartened by these rousing words, Enkidu's spirit was renewed. So together the two men pushed open the gate and stepped through. Then they stopped, gasping at the spectacular view now before them. Great strands of ancient cedars stretched away into the gray mist, and in the far distance a majestic mountain rose up in white-crowned loftiness. It was the Cedar Mountain, home of the gods. Beneath its soaring granite slopes, the two men saw how endless, lush, and beautiful this legendary forest really was, empty of all human beings. Without further delay, they entered these woods, following a well-worn path. It was the trail of the forest guardian, the demon Humbaba. Their first day among the cedars was uneventful. As they lay asleep that night, Gilgamesh burst awake from a nightmare. He reached over and stirred Enkidu. I took hold of a wild bull, Gilgamesh anxiously said. He bellowed and kicked up earth, so that dust darkened the sky. I ran away from him, but he seized me with terrible strength. Then the bull gave me food and water, and I was restored. Enkidu listened closely. After a little silence, he interpreted the dream, saying the bull was Shamash. Quote, when we are in trouble, he will take our hands. Unquote. He sat in the calm night air. Furthermore, Enkidu added, the companions would finish together what neither could accomplish alone. Their united strength was more than twice what either had by himself, boasted Enkidu, quote, like a three-stranded rope. Unquote. The second day's journey into the forest was also uneventful. And again that night, Gilgamesh was awakened by another bad dream. Once more he turned to Enkidu with fear. A mountain toppled, he said. It laid me low and took hold of my feet. But then a man appeared, the handsomest in all the land. He pulled me out from under the mountain and gave me water to drink. My heart grew still. He set my feet on the ground. Unquote. Enkidu soothed his friend and told him that the mountain was Humbaba. The dream, he explained, meant they would overthrow the monster. On the third night, Gilgamesh had a yet more terrifying dream. Darkness covered all light. Lightning and fire spewed from roiling clouds, and it rained death. Then the fire died, and whatever had fallen out of the sky turned to ashes. But after listening, Enkidu again interpreted the images as highly auspicious, once more urging his frightened companion to take heart. By the fourth day of their journey into the cedar forest, they had still seen no one. So Gilgamesh, his courage now restored, took his great axe and chopped down one of the ancient cedars. When Humbaba heard that noise, he came immediately. Who has come and harmed the trees growing on my mountain? The giant monster bellowed, rushing out of the shadows in an instant battle frenzy. The men, struck by mortal terror, turned to flee. But then Shamash, who had been watching from up in the sky, spoke down to them, saying, quote, "Draw near, fear not." Unquote. Gilgamesh, tears flooding his eyes, cried out desperately for protection. So Shamash, answering the terrified king, sent 8 raging storm winds against the charging demon. The winds beat against his eyes and swirled around his arms and legs, immobilizing him. "Let me go, Gilgamesh," the guardian pleaded, as the winds held him frozen. "You will be my master, and I will be your servant." Gilgamesh hesitated, but Enkidu saw his doubt and said, "Friend, catch the bird now." Gilgamesh, hearing the truth in his partner's words, drew back his axe and struck Humbaba in the neck. And then Enkidu did the same, and on the 3rd stroke mighty Humbaba fell, shaking the cedars for miles around. The warriors cut off the demon's head and returned to Uruk in triumph. As they passed through the city gate, all the people rushed up shouting with joy, and the young king was hailed as a hero and benefactor. What a reversal from before! Now the riches of the great forest could be freely used by the city's craftspeople and artists. Wood was a rare commodity in that location at that time. The mighty bull of heaven. After Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered Uruk with the head of Humbaba and joined the people in celebration, they then returned to their palace. The king bathed and dressed, brushing out his long braided hair with scented oils. As he put on his beautiful cloak of gold brocade and precious gems, and then his gleaming crown of state, the goddess Ishtar looked down on him from heaven and saw the king revealed in all his heroic glory. She fell in love with Gilgamesh. "Come, be my lover," she beckoned to him. "Give me the taste of your body." But Gilgamesh only felt anger rise up in him, and he spurned the goddess. In mocking tones, he recounted all her previous mortal lovers, such as Tammuz, whom she had turned eventually into a wolf, and Ish-Ulan, who was changed into a frog. Quote, "You loved me in my turn, and as with them said my fate," unquote, he told her. "The goddess of love lives forever," Gilgamesh finished his tirade, "while humans can only die." As soon as Ishtar heard these words, she flew in rage to her father, Anu. Quote, "Gilgamesh has insulted me," the goddess bellowed as she entered the sky god's chamber. Why not get all cinematic? It's great, it's all right. Anu, seated on his throne of stars, heard her out, and then replied to the mighty queen of heaven, "Didn't you yourself pick a fight," he told her, "so that Gilgamesh recited your iniquities, your bad faith, and your cursings?" Anu's reasoning, however, had little effect on the furious Ishtar. She demanded anyway that he create a fantastic bull and send him to kill the king. If he refused, Ishtar glared, she would break open the gates to the underworld, as she had that power, and the dead would rise and eat all the living. Yeah. On hearing this, Anu could see that Ishtar was implacable. So he made the monstrous bull of heaven. Then Ishtar led the beast down to earth and released him on the bank of the Euphrates, where it ran near Uruk's gates. The gigantic bull thundered and snorted, and then the earth split open at his feet. 200 people fell into the gaping chasm. He snorted again, and another bull swallowed 300. As Gilgamesh and Enkidu ran towards the monster, he snorted again, and the ground split right in front of Enkidu. But the brave warrior sprung up with a mighty leap. He grabbed the bull of heaven by his horns and scrambled over the top. The animal bucked, spat on him, flung shit at him, but couldn't shake him off. Quote, "How shall we overthrow him?" unquote, Enkidu called down to Gilgamesh from the bull's back. Quote, "Distract him, and I'll stick him behind the neck," unquote, the king shouted, drawing his sword and yelling at the bull. As the crazed animal rushed near, Gilgamesh jumped high and plunged the blade into the hilt, just behind the horns. The huge creature faltered, blood gushing out, and then he collapsed in the dirt. Swiftly Gilgamesh and Enkidu thrust in their swords and killed him. Cutting out his heart, they made a ritual offering of it to Shamash. They sat down right there and worshipped the sun god together.